Oh, got it. So why did I play that? Shall I try to explain?
Yes,
So
yes.
so what was that? For me, that was something I made using runway ML, runway machine learning from my own images, sort of Christmassy image, Christmas card type images or advent calendars, and it's interpolating between different images, or it's imagining a jump between the different images, but then it's also drawing upon a model of images and responding to the text prompts using machine learning. So it's partly statistically generated and it's partly my photography. So it's a strange thing that is hard to describe. But in its sort of cheeriness, its Christmassiness or its seasonality, I think that belies some of the real realities around these kind of mechanisms. And I sometimes wonder if AI art is in some ways designed to cover up the really problematic backdrop to these mechanisms, not just the algorithms, not just the consumption of energy they represent, the profligate use of energy for very little, but because enormous energy is needed to store enormous databases, millions of images are used. Those images, we don't know who they belong to. A lot of the time they're just taken. Companies like Google, excuse me, have lied to us again and again about what they do with our data, and have actually always, it turns out, what we thought was privacy, what we thought was incognito was no such thing, and that all of our content, all of our context of being a prosumer, we're actually there to be extracted from and put into these massive models. So we don't know whose work that is. It's a mathematical model of work, but it is indeed referring to the vast corpus of visual imagery that's out there. And probably not everybody's images, clearly not everybody in the world, the corpus is situated. So that's sort of part of the backdrop to that. And my work, which is as a fine artist, is engaged with that material. I'm really interested in how that materiality unfolds. What does it feel like? What does it do? What can it not do? What does it look like? What goes wrong? How do the engines that drive these work? Why do they work like that? Who do they belong to? What can I do with it? Can I break it? Can I understand it? Can I look into it? Is it open? Is it closed? All of these questions have informed my work. So I've been dealing with what would be called AI, what was always called AI when I was at university studying computer science and art when I started. But what I've come to think of as really statistics or data analysis, which is much less sexy, much less mysterious, much drearier. So what does it mean to create exciting things with really, really dreary ingredients is another question. So I'm a fine artist. That's how I started very much as a painter. And I think I see much of the work that I'm still doing as a kind of painterly process. And I think you can see that in the work. But I'm also really, really interested in mechanisms and algorithms, and teach computer programming, teach a number of subjects around critical relationship to, particularly to algorithms, particularly to design. So that all comes into my work as well. And so I currently work, half the time I teach games design at UCL in London, and the rest of the time I teach arts and creativity and education at Cambridge University. But again, through practice, very much through practice is my kind of work. So I've written a lot about all of these things. and this paper, COVIDpreneurism, this is a horrible expression that was invented during the COVID pandemic. I saw COVIDpreneurism was constantly presented as an opportunity, the death of the horrible lingering death of many, many people, and the illness and suffering that resulted from it, a business opportunity. How charmingly put, COVIDpreneurism. And in the United Kingdom, for sure, there was a kind of an arms race around technologies which would solve all our COVID problems through track and trace, through an array of claims around, particularly around mobile technologies and smart technologies. And as far as I'm concerned, they are absolutely 100% failed us. The only technology that really didn't fail us was a medical technology, which our glorious leaders dismissed constantly, or even implied was a conspiracy. So it was a very, very revealing time in terms of ideologies around smartness. So I wrote a chapter of this book called Equality in the City, which is really about how smart city constructs failed us so profoundly.
Oh, we're not seeing you, I think. We've got the
slide
slide
I see. Up. Oh, not got the camera. Let me see. I've probably got a page which has got a picture of it here, if you can see it.
Okay, great.
So, all around me, everything was failing. All sorts of algorithms, just-in-time algorithms for supermarkets were failing. Clearly, the supply and demand algorithms were failing. The track and trace that cost us £39 billion in the United Kingdom failed abjectly, whilst gifting enormous amounts of money to people who were already very, very rich indeed. And underpinning it was an ideology that the more data you have, the more you can know. The more intelligent we become, or our mechanisms become, the more we know. More must make us cleverer, right? Like more money must make us better people. Like, I don't know, bigger cars make us smarter or more attractive. All that stuff, this grandism, this grandiloquent grandism seems to emerge particularly from rapidly accelerating cycles of capitalism, late capitalism. So AI art is part of that. Not only can I make one beautiful artwork, I could make 1,000 in 10 minutes if I wanted to, and sometimes I have. I can do more and more of it, and I would imagine less and less, fewer and fewer people would ever get a chance of relating to it. Why am I making it? What's it for? What does it achieve other than burning fossil fuels in a sort of futile bonfire of vanity? One question I might ask of it. So against that, as an educator, are these constructs of STEM and STEAM, which I'm sure most poor children cannot get away from as constructs, as unquestionably virtuous trajectories for your education. And entangled with that, and all of the institutions I've worked at pretty much have been constructs of design thinking. Design thinking, STEM and STEAM. What could be more wonderful for the young to be nurtured on these constructs? But of course, design thinking, as many really, really interesting critics have written, like Lily Irani, is part of a white supremacist plot to make it seem that the Chinese in particular are incapable of original creative thinking. And it arose a particular crisis in Western capitalism where the ability to manufacture at the same rate as China was attenuating, and the ability to generate patents compared to China was really, really on the wane. So design thinking really solved some problems around who's the best at doing stuff. And their solution was this impalpable white Western capacity for creativity. And I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, absolute BS as far as I'm concerned, but very much serving a purpose within this nexus of STEM and STEAM, and an act in America that was passed called the America Competes Act in 2007. I think it was pushed through by Bush, but I think Obama also supported it, and here in the United Kingdom, Blair and later Theresa May all got into this construct of the requirement to be competitive, and artificial intelligence was seen at the very foremost of the mechanisms which would enable the global north to triumph over the rest of the planet, particularly China. So it's part of a Cold War trope as far as I'm concerned. And STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, is again part of this sort of drive to transform education in particular away from the arts and humanities and into a corporate pedagogy, a corporate agenda, which means that all of us must work for corporations and must serve them. And wrapped up in that is very much a precarious trajectory for us as people. Platform capitalism is as a tendency for a sort of on-demand model of employment. So all the rights and things my parents and grandparents fought for and paid for through things like national insurance in the United Kingdom have gradually eroded to the point that many of us, sometimes we're paid for our work as self-employed people. So it's reverting to the kind of indentured labour that my old ancestors as peasants working on farms would have been paid by piecework with no help. Well, I mean, healthcare has become a very political thing, I know, but with nothing for the very little to show for the profit they generated for their bosses. Of course, this is incredibly dangerous talk in an era where we're meant to think there's only one way of doing things. And I think the AI, the saturation of these algorithms is again part of a trajectory that this is the only way for the human race to move forward. And I think it's a really, really dangerous one. So there's a book by Dan McKillen called Resisting AI, which I think is a really, really good book. Sorry, I don't know if you can see it. You can't see my camera, is that right?
No, but I can hold it up over here.
Oh, great. Resisting AI by Dan McKillen, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence.
It's there.
Great, yeah, that's the one. There's Dan McKillen, one of my colleagues from Goldsmiths. And there are other writers. There's Rua Benjamin, Race After Technology, people like Ali Syed, who's written about decolonial computation. There's a whole range of Ramon Amaro, really important writers who are challenging some of the entangled and implied consensus around what algorithmic, I dread to call it algorithmic thinking, but around where this will lead us and what it's already achieving. And one of the most important ideas is Akili Mbembe's necropolitics. And many of these algorithms, as cute as they are, like the cute little robot that could dance, ends up killing, it ends up being a police robot, ends up being part of a mechanism of punishment. And in the case of some algorithmic technologies, as Rua Benjamin might say, a school to prison pipeline, or the automated decision making, which is not accidentally racist, it's not bias, it's meant to be racist. It upholds the power structure. That's what it's designed to do, right? Huge corporations don't design things to shift power away from themselves. They design things to maintain power. And that power is necropolitical, because who gets healthcare, who gets housing, who gets arrested, who gets a mortgage, who doesn't get a mortgage, means your life expectancy is less or more than someone else's. So it's necropolitics, it's entangled with death, life and death. So lovely little AI art, to me, is a terrible smokescreen away from those realities. But it's very engaging as well. And, I make a lot of it and I'm really interested in it. Here's another thing, this is this Ken Burns effect, where AI is so good at interpolation between different frames and calculating how things are going to run smoothly. And then here, just say, make it look like Edward Hopper, and it can scan through thousands of millions of images probably and have a mathematical representation, which it then puts into its understanding of this image making. It's so easy, it's so fast. It's very, very engaging and beguiling. It's nothing that can't be done by hand, by the way. All this can be done by hand. It's just a kind of a different workflow in a sense, and a very instantaneous workflow. But it's not that innocent, because it also plugs us into dependency upon particular power structures, particular servers, particular companies, particular platforms, particular internet structures, providers of what, all the rest of it. It really, really hooks us on into a massive constellation of dependencies. So I've talked for a long time. Sorry, Eric, because I'm completely dominating conversation.
No,
Loads of other things.
this is great. Please keep going.
Yeah, well, thank you. Loads of other things. I mean, I am a technologist. I love dealing with technology. I like the puzzle of it, and I'm really, really interested in getting things to work and how they work and how they don't work. I'm particularly interested in models of complex systems like cities. And here's a model. I'm using some proprietary software, but also changing some of it. Here's a city, sort of looking very innocuous. It looks like Croydon in South London. And here it's trying to avoid pedestrians, but it doesn't really understand what's happening around. It understands the front, but it doesn't understand the back. And what surprised me was the way these coaches rear up like animals. There's a sort of animalistic quality to them. It's not intended, it's unintentional aspect to the algorithm. And I find that interesting, but also find it it's limiting. And it points to some of the realities of constructs like automated vehicles, which I always find students would get very, very cross with me when I would suggest that a world of automated vehicles was not 5 minutes away, that there are many mathematically intractable problems. Students would get really cross. I don't know why. It's as if there's a hope and a panacea, which I'm afraid technology is not a panacea. To me, the panacea is changing our social structures or power relationships, and technology does not do that. If anything, it converges power, it creates monopolies of power. Here's another one. I don't know if you read about this, Eric, that they trained, I've got the text for it, Volvo's self-driving technology, which had been taught how to respond to large American animals, such as deer, was baffled when encountering kangaroos for the first time in Australia. So I sort of thought I'd have a go and see. I mean, it's ludicrous because game engines don't work by visual recognition. They work with colliders and stuff like that on the whole. But I just thought make a jolly little film about it. Whoops.
Oh boy. Yeah, and just because it's a fascinating story about image recognition, this Volvo case, for essentially, to simplify it and be very brief, the cameras were looking for deer to the right. They were designed to recognize deer, the visual outline and shape of a deer on the road, and the car would stop. When they exported to Australia, the problem was the kangaroo would jump, and when the kangaroo jumped, it essentially registered it as a deer disappearing. And when it landed, it was registered as a deer again. And so it was flickering in and out, which created this massive problem because they took a image recognition technology from one context and they applied it to a context where deer were not the problem, but kangaroos were. And
yeah, and it's symptomatic of another set of major problems around AI is an overfit and an underfit. And there you've got an underfit, but then you've probably got an overfit to a particular cultural milieu, being middle America, whatever, which means that you've got all sorts of types of representation that are either missing or over-egged. And the kangaroo is a really good example of that. But also, I have to say, of a kind of colonialism, which of course has to overlook many, 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 many complexities around different organizations, different morphologies, different appearances, different ways of being. American roads, cities, my experience, tend to be rather more grid-like than most of the places that I've ever been to in the rest of the world. I haven't traveled that far, but certainly in Great Britain, with medieval structures, some of the grid-like structures are, they're not there, and it makes it very, very difficult to map some of these algorithmic sort of predictions to very unpredictable cityscapes. So I think that is really interesting. Here's another one. I love modeling crowds. So what happens if you get an absolutely immense crowd, which is in this case driven by algorithms, sort of flocking algorithms. So there are probably 3 different rules of how they must behave, and the traffic trying to get through at the same time. So here we go. I'll just make it a bit bigger. Sorry, guys.
Oh, thanks.
so they're incapable in some ways of modifying behavior. What happens is the cards are lifted up in the air. It's a really interesting inversion of the automated vehicle sort of trope we're so used to. It's the unpredictability as well that interests me, and something we think of as so under control. I mean, what we were talking about before in terms of the inability to predict the kangaroo type behavior. One of the problems with artificial intelligence as construct is this infinite regress of rules. So I mean, obviously neural networks are not, there's a different construct away from making rules, but to understand everything in the world it takes us back to Borges's ludicrous idea of a map that's bigger than the territory. How can we begin to model every possibility? Just think about it. This is in some ways a sort of ludicrous human hubris, thinking that they can predict and understand everything, as opposed to other models of knowing, particularly post-human models of knowing, which are essentially contingent and can never be laid down so fixedly. There's a real sort of philosophical tension there around what knowledge can and can't be, and how knowledge unfolds. And again, so people say, oh, the problem with AI is bias. People say that to me about 20 times a day. Somebody will say that to me. So, the problems of AI isn't just the bias. Well, I refuse to think of it as accidental. The problem of AI is that it fixes one type of knowing in a hugely colonial way to the entire unfolding of humanity, of all other animals, of everything on the planet. And nothing I know about life convinces me that there is only one type of knowing or being, or one type of intelligence, let alone one, algorithmic form of intelligence can encompass everything. But again, it's I feel like Faustus. It's very interesting. So here recently I've been making 3D models from text generation machine learning. It's trying to learn. The first models are very, very limited and broken. They are very limited. But then after a while, after thousands of iterations, it's beginning, I'm asking for it to do a whale because I'm particularly interested in a book called Moby Dick. And this took me about, how long did it take? About 7 hours to generate. It's an enormous waste. I could have modeled it myself in Blender much, much faster. Really, seriously, I could have. But it's interesting. What's interesting to me is it's almost, I'm probably projecting it, or it feels like a sort of, it's grasping at straws, trying to understand what a whale is, and what it's come up with looks more like the sort of dinosaurs of whales. It doesn't look like a modern whale. And I don't know if that's just a projection or if there is something going on there in the way that the black box of millions and millions of iterations unfolds. So this is part of some work I'm doing at the moment for Mozilla Foundation for MozFest, which is in March, and it's called Monstrous, and that's the model of the whale in this Mozilla Hub space. And I'm using with some great collaborators natural language processing to try and understand Moby Dick in a slightly different way, to try and perhaps summarize it, try and create a new sort of engagement with the text. But I'm really drawing upon the great writer C.L.R. James's analysis of Moby Dick. And Moby Dick is the white whale is pursued by Ahab on this kind of factory ship, this whaling ship, which deals with death and hunts down whales, extracts them from the ocean and chops them up and sort of puts them in tins, and then delivers them to the highest bidder. And C.L.R. James analyzes Moby Dick as really a critique. He writes a critique of capitalism through this, and the poor whale. It offers whales and whaling and the whales community and the way whales live and the oceans offer an alternative possibility, a more collaborative, cooperative way of being, which Captain Ahab can't understand. And for me, I see a relationship there to the extractive nature of constructs of artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's about extraction. And in doing so, we're extracting the last of the Earth's resources to generate what? Kittens? Funny things? At whose expense is this happening? and what's happening to the planet, and are there other types of intelligence, other ways of intelligence, and other ways of being, which are absolutely stamped out by the dominance of this idea of intelligence, one idea of intelligence out of many millions of different ways we know the world. So that's that one. But here, but like a big hypocrite that I am, here's a film that I've made using machine learning with Moby Dick. Just make it bigger, sorry.
I love that.
Oh, thank you. So it is very beguiling. And the idea of making 3D models, this, I don't know if you've seen this algorithm that Eric, it's this was quite hit and miss, and it's quite hard to do it, but it's really predicting from a flat image, from a 2D image here of my great muse, Alfred Hitchcock, is trying to predict the rest of the model. And I've been using these quite a lot recently. They're very, very crude. And then I've been, so much is automated. What we think of as AI or machine learning is, this sort of the kind of text to image process that we're so familiar with is the tip of the iceberg, really, when I think about this, how I made this. First of all, using the 3D model algorithm from an image, and then auto rigging in Mixamo. That's a kind of machine learning, sort of algorithmic process. And then using a game engine to compose them, and then using a kind of computer vision to add a kind of an effect, a kind of a drawing effect. I was absolutely chock full of algorithmic processes. I'm sort of in some ways, the horse has bolted in terms of, I'm not going to have anything to do with these processes. You use a computer, you're using them. So they are there, they're just there. And I've been working with, I suppose, algorithmic arts since about 2004. Really, is when I started using computers in that way to make art, and immediately found, the workflow is incredible. Some of the more recent workflows, don't know if you've used. Let me just see if I've got some. I do think. For example, this, I don't know if you've used this in Stable Diffusion, so you can start Stable Diffusion or Runway, you can have an image. I with something I did in engine and then changed a bit using machine learning or something like Stable Diffusion, and then you can say, well, what would be next to it, and it will gradually make the picture bigger and bigger, imagining entire landscapes for you based on what you've provided and what it already, what it knows from its models of how things could look. And I think when you look also at Blender now has Stable Diffusion plugin, I think this will be our workflow. Whilst we've got the resources to do it, regardless of other people are dying or starving around us as a result of climate crisis, we will continue to use these processes until we just run out of fossil fuel or whatever, until it just becomes ridiculous to waste energy on these processes. But we will, Decadent West will continue to do this whilst they can. I don't know how many more years we have to do this kind of fun stuff. But yeah, so you can have Stable Diffusion as a plugin in Blender, and you can use a sort of text prompt to create new objects, and then you can build up layers. So soon we'll be having, get me a mountain range. Okay, that's one layer. Add some mist to it. That's another layer. Oh, I want some birds flying around on another layer, and then I want them to crash into the mountain. I want something to happen. This I can see that this might be a sort of a new kind of workflow. Where will it end? Is very good. It's kind of another question in the back of that. Yeah. So that's another. You can tell they're kind of strange images, aren't they? The hands are really crap. And again, I don't know if it's a coincidence that like beginning artists or amateur artists are never very good at drawing hands or feet, and algorithmic drawings are very, very bad at drawing hands and feet. But I don't understand why that would be, if it's just a coincidence.
And it's a long-standing problem, the hand thing. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I actually trained one of the first models that I did in Runway was photographs of my partner's hands, 500 and then extended style GAN.
Yeah, I think I've seen those.
And it's just horrendous. It
doesn't
Isn't
it weird though, Eric? Why is it different from a cat? Why is it any different for an algorithmic system?
This is an open question, and
yeah,
it's gotten DALL-E 2 has gotten better. I actually tried to generate some bad hands the other day just as examples and couldn't. They're not great, but they're not as bad as mine were.
Yeah,
which were basically tree trunks, right? They're growing and sprawling.
Yeah,
and never ending.
I just simply don't understand it. We have a corpus of trillions of images of hands that can be as mathematically modeled and grasped as a car or as any other object either that it has an image of. So that is very interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry, I remember that work. That's a beautiful piece of work. I mean, really somehow touching as well. And it speaks to another issue of AI, which is the core issue for me as a theorist, if I might describe myself as a philosopher, is that it's predicated on a mind-body split, right? A Cartesian split is at the very heart of the idea, which comes from Plato, that there is a purer, higher form of representation that is purer and better than reality itself or the thing itself. And that abstraction, that abstracts to language, but to a very narrow type of language at that, to a particular mathematical representation, which has no interest or knowledge in what we know through our bodies, or the fact that we have bodies, or the fact that we're grounded or situated. And so many writers have written about this, from Donna Haraway to Elizabeth Gross, to a whole array of people looking at the problem of negating the body in a system of knowledge. What happens when you remove the body, or even material from these algorithms? And Karen Barrett is so brilliant at that. And Meeting the Universe Halfway, 2007. She's saying that language is a big problem. Language will put forward that everything matters in language and in symbolic representation, but material itself. And why is language better at describing the materials we handle? and than being with the materials itself. So it's really, really weird, dare I say it, Western thinking, global North thinking. And Dan McKillen's written a great paper called it's about the idealism of Neoplatonic thinking, of AI as Neoplatonism. It's harking back to 2,500 years, 3,000 years to Plato. And we think we're so advanced, but we're really reviving very, very, very old, particularly niche ideas. And in doing so, we're yet again cutting out the vast array of different ways of knowing, which particularly represented the global south. It's really, really problematic. And again, you can't convince me that having a sort of anti-bias committee or an AI ethics committee negates the fact that the very construct of knowledge you're dealing with denies thousand eons of human history in different places and human way of being things, doing things, and other animals and plants. And it's so narrow. Narrowness really worries me, and the idea of the singularity, the general artificial intelligence, is about the most colonial construct that's been put forward, and since I'm sorry to say it, since slave trade, since ideas of an overarching construct of who gets to dominate and why, and the idea that this one tiny little way of knowing the world should dominate the planet or the rest of the universe if some people get their way, is so appalling to me. It's a tragedy. But they'll have it. I had a little mini argument with somebody saying, "Oh, but AI will mean that surgeons can do surgery remotely, and it will solve so many problems." I said, "Look, I can't even get access to a doctor. Most British people can no longer get access to basic healthcare. I won't even start on America. So don't talk to me about robotic surgeons. I want basic healthcare before you start extolling the value of what one person in a million might have access to that." I doubt it. So for me, it's far more than doing pretty pictures, doing interesting things.
Yes. I wonder, could we look at the whale sort of short film that you've put together, the Moby Dick one?
Yeah.
Because I found that really captivating. And I wondered if it's not too much to ask, if you might let it run and sort of tell us what we're seeing. So both in terms of what your process was, and also what the model is doing to the information you gave it.
Yeah, so it's from I think it was Deforum or Disco Diffusion. Sorry, I have documents of it, but I can't remember off the top of my head. It's one of those algorithms which is really good at interpolating between one written idea, and another written idea. So show me a car driving along the road, and then 30 frames later, show me an elephant stamping on a car. And it will extrapolate between those and provide the frame. Sorry, I'll just play it. Might turn the sound down.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know there was sound. I didn't hear sound.
Oh, sound is really important. And the sound... Oh, no, can you not hear it?
No, we can't hear it.
Oh, what a shame. The sound to me, I study sound design. And to me, the sound is very old-fashioned process.
Could you, we can cut this out, but could you send me the film and I could...
it's quite big, but thank you, Eric, because it's so important. And so it's adding so much the materiality of the film or the animation.
Well, I have to say, watching it, having not heard the soundtrack, and I'm not taking that away, but watching it even silently was really interesting, because it's such a... I've seen this interpolation model before, right? As you said, turning a car into a horse. Fill in the blanks in between the two.
Yeah.
But I haven't really seen it used as effectively as this. I mean here and there, but it's, a lot of times people use these things kind of to do magic tricks, not to tell stories or to give you a space the way that you've done.
Thank you. I mean, the interesting thing about those algorithms is you can now control the camera angle as well. So it's, you know, moving into a really interesting type of what Lawrence Leck, my brilliant PhD student, would call, and a great artist would call, the cinematic intelligence. So it's, you know, it's algorithmic driven cinema or animation. That does interest me very much. So here I defined a starting point, which was some words from Moby Dick about hunting down a white whale. The white whale is Moby Dick, who Captain Ahab's been chasing for decades. And then at the end, to interpolate, I turn the sound on because I can't stream it in my brain at the same time, to interpolate to the whale attacking the ship and the ship coming in trouble. And in some ways that to me points to this possibility of overturning these extractivist systematized extraction from the planet, which is what C.L.R. James thought was possible from his interpretation of Moby Dick as well. And I have to say Herman Melville's a very interesting writer. He writes a lot about conditions of work, conditions of industrialization, and what happens when there is a resistance to that. At the same time, I asked it to adopt a style closer to Rembrandt, closer to a sort of painter from many hundreds of years ago, because I didn't want it to be photorealist. I wanted it to evoke something of the era of, I mean, Herman Melville's, you know, only over 150 years ago. So, but I didn't want it to be photorealist. That's another problematic around some of the artwork I've seen. I see a sort of sameness of texture. But then what I like, which I didn't plan, is this bobbing backwards and forwards. That's part of the algorithm's sort of finding through space. It's navigation of the problem space. That's not my design, but happily it evokes a seasickness, a dizziness of being on the whaling ship, of the whole enterprise of extracting from the whale, of being on the sea.
What we're actually seeing is it actually just following the next pattern that it's trying to draw from, right?
Yes.
To trace from.
Yes, with no sense that kind of movement's inappropriate in a human cultural frame. You know, very few images, filmmakers would deliberately do that. You know, it's quite sickening. So I'm interested that it would not even consider that. It's not a consideration. It has no body to know about the nausea that might generate. But actually, you know, nausea is something I work with quite a lot in my work. In a way, this is a nauseating business, and I like that it's sickening. It was a sickening business.
And so if I can unpack, and I'm sorry, just to focus on process a bit.
Yeah.
If I'm to guess from looking at this and from what you've said so far, this is a series of still images that have been generated from the text and then asked to interpolate between those still images and then assembled. Is that?
No,
okay.
I didn't. No, none of my own images here.
Okay.
This is drawing upon the cultural imaginary of
Okay.
whaling and whales and the sea. And so no, it's purely text-based, what I gave it as instructions. Some you're right to think it could have been like that, because a lot of my work, I'm taking my own images. I like the first thing I showed you of the fun fair kind of Christmassy scene, but this is purely fishing from the sea of the cultural imaginary. That's why I think some of the images look quite, to me, almost like Japanese woodcuts. I think it's got sort of grabbing at stuff, grabbing at straws, and it's not always coherent. Sometimes they are photographs that are coming. I can see a very photographic texture, and I don't like it. It feels discordant, but at the same time, maybe that, you know, that's interesting too. So no, it's grabbing a mathematical model of the things that I've given it to deal with.
So it was diffusion generating images?
I think this algorithm does use the diffusion process, which is a very odd one, isn't it? Where there's a sort of noise. It's been trained on making images into noise, into sort of on incoherence, and then to go backwards to try and extrapolate from the incoherence something that matches its mathematical model of a whale or a hand. A very odd process. I have an overarching understanding of the process. But the more I think about it, the more odd it is that also seems rather blockchainy inefficient to me as well. So it's another thing we haven't talked about. seems like an extraordinarily inefficient process, a bit like the practice in architecture of knocking houses down to rebuild new ones, which has been discussed quite hotly recently. Is that sustainable? It just seems like a very long-winded process. I mean, yeah, the results are quite interesting, but I'm suspicious of this inefficiency, much like blockchain inefficiency. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then, of course, I've also edited it. I did very little that I do is good enough as it is. I have to then, there's a lot of human labor behind the scenes that we don't know about, but also my own labor in compositing, in editing this, and then putting sound with it. So the sound's really, really important to me, and that's there's no AI sound in this or machine learned sound, but I have been using machine learn. I've been using a sort of style transfer to try and make myself into Alfred Hitchcock. That's another really interesting process. Just going to talk about Hitchcock before we go.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to get conversation back to Hitchcock. So here, this is a process of me becoming Alfred Hitchcock, the director, as a film director. There's music. You can't hear the sound, unfortunately.
No.
It doesn't matter. They're all on Twitter if anyone's interested. So that's me.
Okay.
And then I'm using a deep fake technology where it creates a model on the fly of me, and then it maps it to another model. Only in this case, it looks a bit odd. So that's me half Alfred Hitchcock. That's what I look like when I'm mapped to Alfred Hitchcock. Really strange looking person. But I've also done that with his voice to try and make a model of Alfred Hitchcock's voice. But Alfred Hitchcock was actually from East London in the United Kingdom, and all the models make his voice sound American, and that's because they are American models. And to my ear, that's really unacceptable. It it has a strange ghostly quality of the timbre, but the actual accent is somehow just never Alfred Hitchcock. And that's an overfit to an American model, underfit to the diversity of the way humans speak. And that, again, that's, I think if we could, I think with sound, you can pinpoint that very quickly. You have hearing, you can identify that inadequacy very, very quickly. I think with images, it's a bit sneaky, and your work, Eric's really, really surface some of the ideologies entangled with image making. So the thing with Hitchcock is, I'm really interested in his films, but they're also misogynist, and they're also transphobic, homophobic. Everything's there, symptomatic of Hitchcock's culture and his cultural milieu. And I'm wondering about direction and the hierarchies of direction. What happens when I sort of like a parasite take over, get in there and take over Hitchcock? Clearly unethical, but I think, well, you've defamed many queer communities, so I'll have a pop at you as well, mate, and I think I'm entitled to. That's what I do with my ethics. So I'm quite interested in reworking some of his films, but using some aspects of machine learning to see how the cultural imaginary shifts. And by that, I mean this sort of mass of cultural manifestation, which tells us so much about power structures and representation, if that makes sense. So I've done a lot of work with him and Alfred Hitchcock, but also tried to see if AI can understand some of AI, I keep saying that very loosely, but machine learning, if it can understand aspects of Hitchcock's films. And you've done a lot of sort of trying to see if you can even caption a Hitchcock film accurately, but it just always misses the point. Always does not understand the human drama or tensions, cultural taboos that are portrayed, except to prohibit, I guess. So that was, this is Alfred, you can't hear it, but it's Alfred Hitchcock map. It's me speaking, and it's mapped to me.
I see, yeah.
The deep fake. In fact, here you can see an earlier attempt to do it, which was just horrific, but I had to get better at doing it. Here's one where it's me, it's trying to follow me. But I love the distortion. it's an overfit, to my movements, or just very, very bad, bad ratios. But then I got better at doing it. So this skill here was hours and hours of work to get things working the way I want them. That's, do you relate to that, Eric? It just doesn't happen off the shelf, really doesn't. It requires hundreds of hours of work to get it how I want it.
Yeah, unless you opt to embrace the noise and the glitch, and which can be a way of working.
Oh yes,
as
yes
well.
indeed, yes indeed, yes.
But yeah, I think one of the common myths around AI, I mean, it's certainly true as well. It can be true, but the idea that it makes things easy, it makes different things easy, and it makes other things challenging.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think Siri and Gray's book, Ghost Work, isn't it? Yeah, it's really interesting, where they point out that there are many, many very, very badly paid human laborers, particularly in the global south, whose job is to categorize images. There's a sort of pretense of a holy artificial intelligence by some corporations to hide, and the human labor is hidden. An enormous amount of hidden human labor, and it serves the ideology of thrusting progress to hide the fact that there is hard, bad labor, difficult labor, precarious, awful conditions. That is whitewashed, literally whitewashed away. So that, that's another part of a problematic, is the pretending of automation where there's no such thing.
Yeah, we will talk a little bit about the FFHQ dataset that created this style GAN and how those images were cropped and selected and positioned, and who selected them, how they were selected, going through essentially Amazon's Mechanical Turk.
Yes.
To pay pennies for each image, and you have thousands of these images. And so you actually can't look at the output of that without looking at the output of that labor.
Yes.
The work is there. When you look at one of these faces that doesn't exist. There's a face that does exist, to put it a bit cheekily, right? That put that face there. That is erased by the decisions the sort of orders that they were given to follow, the instructions that they were given to follow by whoever it was. I'm forgetting who it was initially, but
I mean, making models, making models for machine learning is enormously time consuming. I mean, I've tried to do it a bit with the language model for Afro-Hitchcock voice, but it was just so painstaking and so painful. And
my students will be familiar with that because they're going to try.
Right. Yeah, to make a really big models is just crazy. Undertaking.
Yes, we're extending style GAN, so we're priming rather than building our own models, but it's still we're looking at 500 images base and then altered into 1500 to 2500.
Great. Sounds really amazing. Sounds exciting. I mean, it is fascinating. There's no, I do find it wholly engaging. Runway now has this thing that you can make your own models, doesn't it?
Yes,
I haven't played with it yet. Yeah. Great. Yeah, really interesting. So I wanted to, I don't know if you know about Lawrence Leck. He's just a wonderful artist and filmmaker, and his PhD I thought was such a brilliant concept. He was looking at cars, automated vehicles, which are full of cameras and full of sensors of all different types. And he was proposing that actually those vehicles are a kind of cinema, but they're a kind of automated cinematic intelligence, which is not really for it's for humans to drive them around, but the actual mediation and messages and cinematic representations are for the car itself. So it's a really interesting shift in thinking about media. So it's really worth having a look at some of his work. He's done some very interesting things about cultures around AI, but also around talking about design thinking, Sino-futurism, talking about Chinese culture in a really, really interesting way as a kind of artificial intelligence. It's very witty, clever, and very skilled and interesting work. And then someone like Harsha Balasubramanian talks about the visual as itself an ideology. Harsha is blind and very well positioned to talk about seeing as not as seeing is not a given. Seeing is also a construct, and Harsha's work's very much worth tracking down and seeing what she has to say about vision and our ideas of this physiological vision, but there's also ideological vision. And that, again, in AI images, that seems to come really surfaced, the ideologies of, as in your work with the kiss, who gets to kiss, and what are the power structures embedded in the idea of a kiss, who's resisting the kiss and who's giving it, and who's, I think that was a really brilliant piece of work, Eric.
Oh, thanks.
I'm looking forward to introducing it to my students next term.
Thanks.
Pleasure. So, yeah, was there anything else I've covered so much? My PhD I started it before there was, there were no algorithms. You could just pop something as a chat in and get an image. It was sort of a bit more painful, and I was doing a lot of work with CCTV and trying to generate stories from CCTV in my own very clunky way, sort of proto computer vision, trying to work out if there was a bus at a bus stop and what would happen to someone if there was clearly no bus coming down the road, and trying to see if I could make a book that would understand readers was the essential idea of it. Seems like a long time ago, and of course the day I handed it in, it was already out of date because these technologies move forward so quickly.
Yes. Yeah. We're recording in early December, so possibly by the time students see this, there will be a whole new realm of tools that we are not even acknowledging.
Absolutely. I can see that within 6 months we'll probably be Photoshop or sort of Premiere Pro will be using text-driven aspects of that visuality, if we've got the resources to continue doing it. Of course, here they're talking about blackouts because the wind has died down, and our government's made a series of very bad decisions, even though it claims to be technologically so driven. It clearly was a lot of wishful thinking around what technology could achieve, if I may be so partisan in saying that.
Well, I wonder, it points, if you don't mind, just spending a brief sort of our last final moments together thinking through where we're often talking about this idea of application and concepts, and what's interesting about all the work that we've seen is that there's a criticality embedded into your practice, right? You're often in sort of a tension between the tools and not to put words in your mouth, but what the tools represent. I wonder if you have some ideas for students who are maybe tackling this this tension as well, for navigating it, and where to weave and flow. And
really nicely put, and you're so right, there is a tension there. I mean, I think as a sort of queer person, I've always felt the tension with everything I was born into. I felt at odds with and tense around, including technologies, because of their implicit models of what's right and what's wrong, and who's a real person and who's not a real person. So it's not sort of new to me, that sense of tension, and I'm sure many others people feel it for many different reasons. But I still think our technologies tell us a lot about our power structures. They tell us a lot about where we're coming from, where we're going to, what we've done right, what we've done wrong. So I think they're really incredibly important to be with and to examine, and to speak truth to power about where they are failing us, and to not allow one dominant message around technology to emerge. There needs to be an array of different positions around it. So whatever your relationship to it, that's will come from your life experience and who you are, and that's, you have every right to interrogate technologies and do things that make sense to you. But I hope decent people, that's right, it's a terribly homogenizing thing, but I hope anyone who cares about the planet and other animals and other people will be mindful of these mechanisms, how these mechanisms work, and perhaps how they might work, how other mechanisms might work in a different way. That's as ideological, that's as much as I can hope for.
Well, that's great. That's a wonderful closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to talk to you.
You too.
And I'll send you the whale thing. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a good week and weekend.